Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Government Capital Program Management, What to Consider. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right. Well, we have a great lineup of Moss Adams presenters today. We have Stephen Bacchetti, Director, Colleen Rozillis, Director, and Keith Simovic, Senior Manager at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console if you would like more information. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Keith to go over the agenda. Keith?
Perfect. Thanks, Amy. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Good morning, everyone, of course, and welcome. We're really glad that all of you are here with us today and hope you've been able to join us recently for a few of our other webcasts in this government webcast series that we've been doing this whole spring and throughout the summer as well. And so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith Simovic and I'm a Senior Manager, and I focus primarily on performing audits and some consulting work for many of our governmental clients, including probably many of you that are on the call here today. And I'm pretty excited about the topic for today because it's one where we've been hearing a lot from our clients and others in the industry about some of the challenging aspects of managing a successful capital program. And our goal today really is to help you along that journey and hopefully provide some insights on maybe some tips and tricks that work and will help you be successful with capital program management. And I'd say luckily for all of you, you don't have to listen to just me for this presentation, as we're fortunate enough to have 2 of our firm's experts in this area join us to help provide their insights as well. And with that, we're planning to discuss a variety of topics today, as you can see on this slide, ranging from capital planning to procurement strategies, budget management, financing, reserves, deferred maintenance, and finally, if time permitting and everything, we'll close things out with a little Q&A session at the end. And if not, if we run out of time, we can definitely save all of the questions you submit and we'll follow up with each of you individually after the presentation so that we can cover each of those. All right, I think we're ready to kick things off, and I'll pass things along to our Moss Adams Director, Steve Bacchetti, who will be taking us through the first few topics. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Keith. Good morning, everyone. As Keith noted, my name is Steve Bacchetti, and I lead our construction audit and advisory group at Moss Adams. We have a lot of great content for you today, and we hope you enjoy it. Now onto the presentation. Capital planning. But first, we have our first polling question. Over to you, Amy.
All right, thank you. So our first polling question is, which area of capital program management are you most interested in? A, capital planning, B, procurement and contracting strategies, C, cost and budget management, D, capital financing and capital reserves, or E, all of the above. And we will give you a few moments to respond. To respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. And if you cannot see the submit button, just please enlarge the slide area and you'll be able to see it. All right, everyone's pretty quick this morning. Looks like most have responded, so we will show the results.
Great. So no surprise, all of the above was the most commonly answered question, so you guys are in the right place. All right, program life cycles. Each project or program follows these general life cycles summarized here. Understanding where you're at within your program is critical. The general life cycle stages are planning, programming, design, construction, completion at closeout. During the planning and programming phases, your organization's defining needs, scope, and procuring for services. Contractors typically get involved during the programming and design stages. It's important during the planning and programming and design phases that you understand your contract types, your cost of work definitions, which we'll cover later, to help you manage your budgets and control your costs. Today we'll be focusing on planning and programming as you head back and start assessing maybe the new needs for your program based off the impacts from COVID. Planning. The purpose of this step is to assess your current state. So we generally see that organizations need to perform a needs assessment. That is assessing the condition of your capital assets owned, controlled, and maintained. Many times department heads and consulting engineers complete the step. Information is obtained through an inventory process, and data generally includes information such as the description of the assets, the name of the controlling department, location, purpose, or use, construction date, expected life, description, any major renovations in the condition of the asset, etc. Next, prepare funding alignment. The purpose of this step is to determine how much resources your organization has and the timing for your capital plan. Organizations need to understand how COVID potentially has impacted your operating budgets, sources of funding, and whether your organization has the ability to tap into other funding sources to support capital program requirements and needs. We often see most programs are funded through direct appropriations from dedicated capital funds within the general fund or special revenue sources. The use of revenue bonds or financing capital projects are also very common, and Keith's going to cover this in detail a little bit later. And then the one thing to note, impacts to historical funding sources, proposed new revenue sources, including tax bonds or grants, should be considered because the situation may have changed. Next, facilitate project scope and definition sessions. This step sounds exactly how it reads. What are your needs as an organization? What are your requirements? And what are the scope and definitions needed to address these? Next, establish requirements and prioritization schedule. This is a big one. Like every organization, there are generally more needs than money available. Criteria must be established, which will be used as a guideline for prioritizing project funding. The criteria should be put in writing by appropriate personnel and available to key stakeholders. The criteria established should facilitate ranking projects on a high, medium, low priority basis or equivalent. High priority projects are generally those required by law or improve safety. Medium priority projects generally include those that prevent deterioration of assets, improve delivery of services, and low priority projects generally those that support delivery of service that may be declining or improve the quality of life but are not essential. And then finally, establish process and progress meetings. This is a critical part in any planning process, determining who will be involved in the project scope and definition sessions. And this is very, very important for those members within that group establish their respective roles and responsibilities. Once the parties have been determined and the role set, regular meetings should be conducted to outline the status of the capital planning progress and execution of the projects. Next, programming. Common programming steps include developing the master plan. This includes establishing long-range strategies focused on development and sustainability of your organization. Generally, this includes broad participation and identifies needs 10 to 25 years in the future. Regular updates to these plans are important to establish development and infrastructure needs as requirements and conditions change. Next, implement and utilize capital improvement plans, which is more granular to identify present and future needs requiring capital improvements. Operate for a shorter duration. Generally, it's 3 to 5 years, and list the projects and scopes with corresponding revenue and or financing sources. Assessing staffing models. This is the document assessing how you're going to manage the work. Are you doing it in-house? Are you outsourcing it? Are you doing staff augmentation? And then finally, within programming, apply best practices. So this includes having a procurement plan and policy to ensure competitive and transparent vendor and contractor selection. This should include construction delivery methodologies, for example, design bid, build, design build, and the contract type options that are appropriate for the scope of work, which we'll cover a little bit later. Define program control structure and procedures, which means how does your capital program operate? And generally a good starting point is to look at your policy procedures. If you can't find them, then that's probably a good place to start. Build contractual controls such as cost of work definitions within guaranteed maximum price contracts. We'll cover that later, but that's generally the contract type for major capital projects. And then finally, assessing the project schedule and reporting these schedules to the appropriate stakeholders to ensure that your project schedules are meeting organizational requirements and expectations. Procurement strategies. So these are the general contract types that we see when we do these types of assessments: lump sum, time and materials, cost plus, guaranteed maximum price. I'll go through these briefly just so that you know what the options are and the benefits of them. So lump sum contract includes fee and the cost of work. It assigns the majority of the risk to the contractor. However, the risk, if not procured competitively, could include higher markup, change orders, and quality of materials. Lump sum contracts have been a disadvantage versus other contract types during COVID, with many of the uncertainties, whether it's increases in lumber, steel, safety equipment, reduction in labor productivity. Next, time and materials. The owner pays for the cost of work plus a set markup. Generally, the owner and contractor establish labor rates, material costs, equipment rates prior to the contract execution. Risk here include no incentive to manage costs, low productivity, for example, unless there's proper owner supervision. Next, cost plus, similar to that of a T&M, but there's a cost of work definitions, but there's no budget. So again, this has a lot of the common risks that we see in T&M. There's no incentive to manage the cost, which could potentially result in low productivity, which often requires more supervision by the owner. And then my favorite contract type. So if this is your favorite contract type, great. We have that in common. It's the guaranteed maximum price contract. And this is generally used for the The major capital projects, more complex projects, the owner pays for specified allowable costs, which is defined in the cost of work definitions, which we'll go over shortly, plus a fixed fee or a fee percentage on the cost of work. The contractor guarantees the project to be built within a predetermined amount. Contractor assumes risk for cost overruns. However, the risks that may occur within this contract type are poor contract language and poor review controls over cost compliance and the management thereof. And now on to our second survey question. For you, Amy.
All right, thank you, Steve. So our second polling question is, how well does your agency manage capital costs? A, we're great at estimating and controlling costs. B, we come in on budget most of the time. C, we could be better. Or D, great question, I don't know. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. We'll leave it up another 5 seconds or so. Okay, here's the results.
Great. So these are excellent results. So I like that we could do better. That's my favorite answer, because there's always something you can improve upon. For those that said, great question, I don't know. If you have construction, maybe we should connect after this presentation, or ask someone within the organization that would know. That those are generally things that you should know. Cost and budget management. So these are the cost of work definition examples. Generally for major capital projects, the most common methodology is a design build with a guaranteed maximum price and strong cost of work definitions. And what does that mean, having strong cost of work definitions? And I'll provide a few examples below. So first, include competitive bid procedures. It's important to articulate within the contract documents the need to attain competitive bids on all or major contractor and or subcontractor work. Generally, we'll see at least the MEPs of the world, which is the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, require 3 bids. This is also especially important for any contractor self-perform work. Requiring the 3 bids and obtaining the owner approval requirement is a great starting point, because it offers your organization an effective comparison between bidders to verify cost competitiveness without being overly burdensome for either yourself or the contractor. Next, clarify allowable and unallowable labor. One of the most effective ways to manage the cost of the project is to clearly define allowable and unallowable rates, along with the associated burden amounts. This generally includes determining if labor charges are based on actual wages or predetermined rates, as well as defining on-site versus off-site requirements. Adding an owner approval requirement for non-approved labor types further protects each party from unanticipated cost or audit exposures. Without this clarification, it's easy to go into gray areas that can quickly turn into disputes or overruns. Next, set rates and caps on owner contractor equipment. By establishing set equipment rates, allowable equipment charges, and charge caps, owners are protected from unexpected overruns. This may include defining whether rates are charged hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly, and typically includes adding an owner approval requirement for non-approved equipment types. Also, having the minimum documentation expectations to evidence the use of the equipment is good. And finally, you'll get brownie points for me if you include not to exceed limitations within the contract documents for any contractor and equipment. Next, define change order reporting requirements. Change orders are not uncommon, so they should be anticipated and managed accordingly through the contract documents. This can be achieved by defining mutually approved price, agreed upon unit pricing, or requiring itemized backup for change orders with actual cost backup. requiring validation to back up the change orders helps prevent excessive charges. And then finally, add a right to audit clause, which actually has its own slide. It's that important. So incorporating a clause stating that the project costs are auditable establishes the expectation that all costs billed to the owner are going to be reviewed, audited, and validated for contract compliance. Without this wording, the contractors may not be contractually obligated to provide this information, even if it's requested. And if contractors aren't aware that this level of documentation is an expectation from the commencement of the project, they may not have it available or readily available. So the right to audit clause helps you mitigate project and program risk. Knowing your cost and ensuring the cost is compliant with the contract terms is essential to preventing excessive charges. And then also timely review of the project cost documentation can help you with your contractor mitigate any potential gray areas and come to a reasonable and successful outcome for both parties. And then finally, project performance. So the keys to success, as you can see, it's pretty easy. Just follow the steps that I've outlined here. Just kidding. With great people and a team of expert advisors, leveraging technology and tracking performance is critical. So identifying key data for stakeholders, and this generally includes budget, forecast, schedule, project and scope descriptions, change orders, cash flow, funding availability, etc. And as you know, capital programs can be very complex when you consider the evolving needs, the various funding sources, the varying project statuses and issues that may occur on them. So having a system that monitors and manages project data real time with minimal manual effort will keep all parties on the same page, track performance against established goals, and help identify potential areas of risk that can potentially undermine the success of your program. And with that, I will pass it over to Keith.
All right, well, thanks, Steve. So now we're going to turn our attention towards another critical area of capital program management. And of course, you just heard from Steve about the importance of capital planning and developing kind of multi-year capital plans. So the next piece is to provide an overview of the various financing methods that governments typically use for this purpose. And, you know, those decisions are really important as they can have significant impacts on the current and, of course, future budgets as well, and the overall financial picture of the organization. And you might also think about the impact those decisions have on both current and future generations within your communities that you serve as well. So, I mean, these are significant dollars we're talking about, so it's really important to understand the different financing mechanisms, the pros and cons of each, and be able to have conversations within your organizations about those pros and cons when you think about navigating through your approach to financing capital programs. That way you can better manage your capital programs, the annual budget, and your government's overall financial picture to be able to achieve those capital plan goals, as well as your goals for healthy financial metrics for your organization as well. So that's our plan for this next section, but before we dive in, I think we actually have another polling question. So Amy, I'll pass it over to you so we can see what our audience thinks about this next question.
All right, thank you, Keith. So our third polling question is, what is the most challenging aspect you face with implementing or maintaining a successful capital program? And there are several options and challenges listed. If it's all of them, you're going to want to select E. And then I also want to take this time to remind you to submit your questions for the presenters in the Q&A window. And we do have quite a bit of content to cover today, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards to get you the information that you need. All right, we'll leave it up a few more seconds. Okay, here are the results.
Perfect. Thanks, Amy. And it's kind of funny. I think we kind of tricked you guys. I think our first polling question was asking about what you were most interested in and had a lot of these areas maybe worded slightly differently. And this one's asking about, well, what are the challenges you face? So I would think that those would kind of fit hand in hand as you're kind of interested in how to solve some of those challenges, how to navigate through them. And that's what we're hoping to do today. So with the top answer again being all of the above, like we saw earlier with the first question. So there you have it. Okay, so for these next few slides, we're going to walk you through the primary financing mechanisms that we see at our clients and then compare and contrast the pros and cons of each. So this first method is what's known as a pay-as-you-go approach. And this is a fairly common approach we see as part of an overall capital financing strategy. And we see this most often used for projects that are smaller in size, or maybe even when an organization may not have access to issue debt that they would otherwise consider for financing capital projects. And because this method is funded annually through the budgeting process, I'd say this approach provides probably greater budget transparency than some of the other methods and provides more encouragement for management teams to live within those annual budgets, right? And on top of that, because the capital expenditures are funded through annual revenue sources rather than, say, long-term debt, the interest savings from not issuing debt can be put towards other projects or services. So taking this approach helps to avoid premature commitments of funds, but also conserves credit. So that way you have capacity to issue debt when necessary, or of course in emergency situations as well. So with all that said, you can see there's a lot of positives about this method, and it makes sense overall why this would be used for smaller projects. But then on the flip side, you might start to see why it would be really challenging or probably in a lot of cases impossible to finance larger capital projects through the annual budgeting process. So when we think about some of the drawbacks to this method, we think about things like long wait times for new infrastructure. And again, if you're trying to fund this through annual revenues, taxes, and user charges, then it becomes very difficult to finance significant capital projects in the time frame that is set out in your capital planning process. And on top of that, your communities could be negatively impacted by some of those delays, and they may also be financially impacted in certain ways by the projects they are asked to pay for through the budgeting process. And I'll explain that a little bit further. So capital projects, and specifically infrastructure projects, can have long, useful lives that go past 10, 20, 30, 40, or even 50 years in a lot of cases, depending on the asset we're talking about. And if we're financing that through annual charges, we're asking our current taxpayers, ratepayers, and others to pay for assets today where they might not be around to realize the full benefit of those assets. In that case, it's important to think about the useful lives of the assets being constructed, and of course the time frame for when those assets are paid for. And again, that's why we find that the pay-as-you-go method is most commonly used for smaller projects and assets with shorter useful lives. All right, so if we transition to the next method, we're going to be talking about debt financing, and I think I'll first talk a little bit about the pros here. Unlike the pay-as-you-go method, issuing debt spreads the costs over the useful life of the asset. So the asset is paid for over the period of time that it's being used. So positive there is that the beneficiaries of the assets, or the community served by your organization, will be paying for those assets as they are receiving the benefit of the assets. So you have this matching, right, of payment and benefits received over the life of the asset. And also, when comparing this to the pay-as-you-go method, debt financing projects can free up funds to provide additional capacity to invest and generate investment income for your organization. And of course, that can help with covering maybe the interest payments on the debt in some cases as well. And then thinking back on the capital plan and the delays caused by the pay-as-you-go method, debt financing, on the other hand, can help ensure that the projects and infrastructure are completed and delivered in line with the timelines that we set out in our capital plans. And then, based on all those factors, you can start to see why debt financing is a great tool to consider in certain cases. And as shown on the slide here, there are different time frames for repayment depending on the type of borrowing. So it's important to consider each one of those and the type of project being financed, so that again, yeah, we've got this matching of the repayment with the useful life of the asset. So as you'd expect, debt isn't the right solution for financing in all cases. And there's obvious drawbacks to using this method, and of course with overusing this method. Whenever we issue debt, we're putting constraints on future budgets to service that debt. So when this method is overused, we find an organization's options and overall flexibility with providing services to their communities are more constrained. And then an over-reliance on debt financing can create issues with the overall financial picture of your organization, right? And make it more challenging to meet restrictive financial covenants or other financial metrics that maybe rating agencies would use to evaluate the overall health of your organization. And there's also, of course, limits imposed on issuing debt. So that means, there's only so much debt that an organization can carry on its books, and if that capacity is used up, the government is forced to use other methods to finance capital projects. So based on these items, we see that issuing debt is a good option for financing certain capital projects, but we have to be cognizant of the risks of issuing debt, and especially with issuing too much debt, which can get an organization into trouble. We see this out there in the industry from time to time where there might be a lack of capital planning and some of the things Steve was talking about earlier. And so the consequence is that when significant projects come up and are unexpected, there's a tendency to always just issue debt to finance those projects. That lack of kind of careful capital planning and the related financial planning creeps up over time, and eventually the capacity to issue debt and the burden on the budget can become so significant that the projects get delayed and the annual budget gets so tied up with the debt service payments that your organization can struggle to provide other services to its communities. And that's the situation where we want to help you avoid. And I think this next section, and what Colleen will expand on a little bit later, comes into play. So the next mechanism for financing capital programs we want to talk about is reserve funds. And this is one we want to focus some time on because I'd say it's used quite a bit less than some of the other methods we've covered. But when we think about the tools needed to have a successful capital program, this can be a really important aspect in the overall financing of the program. On the positive side, a reserve fund program can sync up with your capital plan and really provide financial security in helping you meet your capital planning goals without some of the more, say, negative impacts of the other financing methods. So for one, reserves can be used as pressure release valves. So when you have unplanned or accelerated capital replacements, you have the ability to pull from reserves when annual revenues don't provide the funding needed to finance those expenditures. That still gives you flexibility in your annual budget, but it also doesn't burden you with additional debt, and that eliminates the impacts of interest costs. And those reserves are also typically help with some of the metrics ratings agencies evaluate as well. So having certain reserves in place can actually help to improve the overall financial picture of the organization, and thus lowering the cost to borrow when you need to. And then finally, you can take the funds in the reserves and invest them. So that's going to provide even more of an opportunity to achieve your capital goals without having to collect additional amounts from taxpayers, ratepayers, and others. So if we flip to the other side, the negatives are really focused on the challenges with initially setting up the reserves program and obtaining buy-in from key stakeholders. There needs to be investment in the overall capital planning process and consistent coordination between several departments to draft those reserve policies. And that can be really time-consuming and challenging, as we've heard from a number of our clients where we've been able to help and advise in this area. It's also challenging to figure out how much to set aside in reserves or to determine the length of time to fund the reserves. And it can also be challenging to get buy-in, of course, from management. And I mentioned the governing bodies as well, to commit funds to a reserve program rather than spending those funds on providing other services to the community. And as you can imagine, this isn't always the most politically popular or exciting move to make, but it's an important one to at least talk about, given all of the benefits that can be realized long-term for your organization if a reserve program is established. So I know Colleen is going to talk about reserves a bit more, so I want to touch on each of these next couple of slides briefly before she covers reserves in more detail in a few minutes. But the first thing I wanted to leave you with in this section is, what are the keys to establishing a reserves program? And I think the biggest piece that this slide is getting at is thinking about all of these different factors to help you draft and adopt a reserves policy. What are the intended goals of the reserves? How will the reserves be funded, and what are the triggers surrounding the acceptable use of the reserves? How will we monitor or evaluate the reserves periodically just to make sure that they're meeting their intended goals? All of those questions, all of those things should be discussed so you have those discussions and buy-in from stakeholders and a policy that can be followed and monitored going forward. Another big question we hear from our clients a lot is, what is the right amount to set aside for a capital reserve fund? This is another piece to carefully consider when setting the reserve program policy, and you'll want to work closely with those involved with capital planning and other areas to determine the intended use of the reserves, the condition of the capital assets currently, estimated replacement costs, anticipated timing of replacement, and how much will be financed through other mechanisms, including the ones that we've talked about. And once the amount is set, that monitoring piece is really important to ensure that the reserves are being funded adequately in line with the plan and that the reserves are being spent on their intended use per the adopted reserves policy. And so for my final slide here on financing, I just want to say, this isn't always the easiest financing approach to adopt. We totally recognize that. And for those of you who may have been through the process in the past or maybe worked with someone from our team on helping to set up this process, I would guess you've experienced some of these challenges, and that to get through the process successfully, you got to include multiple departments in the conversation and planning process. We've got a listing of various departments that we typically see in these conversations on the slide here, but there may be other stakeholders at each of your organizations as well that you'd want to include in that. But the goal is to make sure each of those departments will have a seat at the table and be able to provide input on how to best draft that reserves policy in a way that will help your organization achieve its capital program goals while providing the best overall flexibility when determining how to finance those projects. So I'll stop there as we move to our next polling question real quick, and then we'll pass it over to Colleen to delve into this topic a bit further. So Amy, go ahead and take it away with the next polling question.
All right, so our last polling question is, does your agency have a capital reserve policy? A, yes, B, no, C, we're working on it, or D, yes, but it could be better. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. We'll also be sending the slides via email tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast. Okay, we had quick responses on this one, so here are the results.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Well, this looks like, I would say, kind of a better than average response, that we've got almost half of the folks here have a policy in place. And I think it's also pretty common that we see the answer C and D, right? We're working on it, or it could be better. And we'll kind of get into the policy in just a minute, but what we see often is we put a capital reserve policy in place some time ago. Often a lot of our clients have policies that they put into place in the 90s, and then we just haven't looked at it in a long time. And a lot has changed in the capital planning and programming universe in the last 20 years. It's a really great time to take a look at your policy. I've done quite a bit of work with local governments, higher education entities, and tribal governments looking at reserve policies. So I'll just go over some reserve policy best practices in this section. I wanted to start with just a reminder for you, and also a reminder for your elected officials and governing boards, particularly important for them, that cash balances are not reserves. Yes, we have a big list of capital projects and needs. No, we can't just use all that cash on hand to fix all the sidewalks, to put in all those bike lane projects, to do all of the building projects that we want to, especially as both Steve and Keith mentioned. We have debt service and bond covenants. We've got operating reserve goals. We've got lots of other things that we want to accomplish here. So when we think about our overall cash balance, really communicating very clearly to all of our stakeholders, to members of the public, what's already committed and what's important for us to have for our general financial health, including our capital reserves. So when we're establishing a reserve policy, the first thing that's the most important is to really identify the purpose of the reserve. Make sure that we're accounting for all of the assets that could fall underneath this reserve. We always recommend including fleet, equipment. We include technology. I'll cover that in just a little bit. We also want to say in a policy statement, we want to assert our values, right? So in that second bullet, we're talking about maintenance and preservation. I'll talk more about deferred maintenance later, but including it in your reserve policy really is key. I was talking to a public works director just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that he said, it has really stuck with me, which I guess means that I'm like a very cool person. All of us here are very cool people because this is our favorite topic. He said, we're building public assets. They're meant to last forever. And that means we want to do it right and we want to take care of them well. And when we're putting together a capital reserve policy, that's a really great place to start, right? We want to do this right. We want to take care of our assets well because these are public assets we want to last forever. And so approaching our work in that way when we're approaching a policy is a really great way to think holistically about our program as well. So the number one question, and Keith mentioned this too, how much do we need to set aside and how do we start from scratch? The number one way that we can establish our target fund level is through doing a facilities condition assessment. If you haven't done a facilities condition assessment recently, absolutely the number one recommendation that I would have is get a facilities condition assessment done. They do cost money, they do take time, but understanding what your needs are is the most powerful way to then communicate out to everyone exactly how we're going to go ahead and accomplish this, right? How are we going to fund this and what do we need to do? And then you can start making a plan. So if you have an FCA, if you have your asset management program and all of your assets in there and understand what your needs are, you can identify what your deferred and due maintenance costs are and put that into your target fund level. Also, with your capital improvement program and your asset management plan, you can identify those funds. And then the Building Research Council recommends every year setting aside 1.5% to 3% of the replacement value of infrastructure. That number came about in kind of that big capital improvement push in the 90s. I would expect at some point in the next decade, we'll probably get a refresh of that because there has been a lot more attention on infrastructure in the public policy realm. And I would expect that number to also just bump up because of the cost of construction, because of aging infrastructure. So we might see that recommended number go up to 2.5% to 5% or even more. Whatever you think in terms of your organization and what your needs are, you could definitely increase that number for your reserve policy, but this is a good rule of thumb. When you're setting up a reserve policy for capital, we strongly recommend including technology in your capital reserve as a sub-fund if you don't already have a technology reserve. We are really seeing today that technology is infrastructure. Technology is the backbone of our organizations. For example, we saw this past year, many school districts actually purchased student laptops and hotspots and other hardware out of their capital funds and their levy dollars in order to make sure that students could remote learn adequately. So with the shift to software as a service, we're really seeing, we want to make sure we're supporting all of our services, that we're making sure that we're achieving unanticipated needs, that we're getting everything accomplished. Like, let's make sure that we've got technology covered here. When we're establishing that target level, we want to think about major enterprise systems. In the past 3 to 5 years, most of our clients have replaced or starting to replace their ERPs. So some have borrowed for that, some have planned. I've had just one client that had that cash on hand. So when that comes around again, and it will, you want to be prepared because it's going to be even more expensive. So understand what the replacement schedule is for your enterprise hardware and software. Understand those upgrade, depreciation, and replacement schedules. And also, if you have a technology strategic plan, understand the cost of those potential enhancements that are in that strategic plan. If you don't have a technology strategic plan, you definitely should get on board and put something in place there. That can definitely be as little as doing a couple of whiteboarding sessions with some key folks at the table, just thinking about what do we think that we need to get us efficient and effective and achieving contemporary business practices. It can be as in-depth as really putting together a 5 to 10 year strategic plan. A couple of considerations as you're going through establishing or updating your reserve policy. Really take a look at it in conjunction with your capital planning process. So go through your CIP process, make sure it matches up with how you're planning for your reserves as well. Again, thinking about integrating IT, I really want to put a plug in for integrating fleet and equipment as well so that we can have comprehensive projected expenditures there, and then making sure that's all included in your financial forecast so that you can do scenario modeling for some of these large capital expenditures. Associated with that, you're going to want to have good policies and procedures that back this up. So who's responsible for the maintenance associated with that? Each infrastructure area should be assigned an owner. Everything needs to be inventoried. We should understand maintenance and replacement needs and identify what those are. Again, really simply understanding what your needs are is a huge step toward being able to make a plan for paying for your needs. And then when we have replacement and upgrade needs for enterprise technology, if we can get to a per user fee so that we can plan for that in advance, then we can go ahead and start setting aside those funds for things like our ERPs. All right, and let's talk about deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is the cause of a lot of these expenditures, and deferred maintenance, you know, aging infrastructure is really a growing issue nationwide. Something I often hear from my public sector clients is just how hard it is to engage elected officials in budgeting for deferred maintenance because it's invisible. We don't usually cut ribbons on a new HVAC system. We don't ever have a problem with the sewer system until our toilet doesn't flush, right? And so it's very, very hard to get people excited about deferred maintenance. But we do know that public buildings now average over 50 years old. And we also know since the Great Recession that less and less public funds have been put into infrastructure. And as a result, it's getting more and more expensive for us as a whole. And when we think about the true cost of that, $1 we don't spend today can cost us $4 or more in catastrophic or replacement costs in the future. Some organizations, unfortunately, run facilities to failure in order to get funding. And even if we don't run our facilities to failure, it does decrease the life of our assets. It decreases the efficiency or just, you know, kind of the livability of our assets. People don't like working in offices where the air conditioning or the heat goes out, where the windows don't open, where the carpet needed to be replaced 15 years ago when we couldn't afford to do that. Compliance issues with ADA especially, and we also see safety concerns as well in some of these facilities, especially with respect to transportation facilities and buildings when we haven't been able to update them to make sure that they are up to code. So if that sounds familiar to you, you are not alone. This data is primarily from the US DOT and the infrastructure report card, and it really does show what a crisis we're in. Probably school districts are in the best shape, and that's primarily because voters typically support levies and bonds related to school capital because people support their kids being in new school buildings. I would say conversely, higher ed is in probably the most challenging position. And that's really because there was a building boom post-World War II, you know, kind of 1950s, 1970s. If you think about most college campuses, enrollment really jumped during that time. And as a result, there are just tons and tons of buildings built during that time. And all of those buildings are about the same age now and have the same types of needs. And many of them need to be just fully replaced. And they don't necessarily have the same funding options as different other types of infrastructure. Kind of similarly, and we're seeing this conversation happen nationally about the U.S. highway system, you know, local roads are having the same conversation because we built so many of them in the 50s and 60s, and then they're all kind of coming due now. Roads and bridges are especially expensive, and many of them have been patchwork replaced over the last few years. So Keith covered financing very well. I'm not going to go into depth here, but what we have seen deferred maintenance effectively addressed in multiple ways. And the most important thing is engaging your governing body in understanding what's at risk and really talking about, we have to cover deferred maintenance. We can't just build new things, right? We can't just cut ribbons on a new bridge. We have to replace existing bridges. We have to really address our facility needs before we just go ahead and build new things. The rule of thumb when we think about preventive maintenance is to spend at least 2 to 6% of your annual operating budget on preventive maintenance. For a lot of our organizations, we would recommend more than that if you're able to spend it just because of the backlog. And then as a management team, just some final recommendations. You should be conducting regular condition assessments, you know, best practices every 5 years. They are expensive. If you can get to them every 10 years, that's great. And thinking about how you communicate with your governing body and with the public, thinking about, okay, this is a need. How are we going to explain deferred maintenance in a way that really connects with people and that they understand so that we can all be on the same page? We really recommend including this in your strategic planning, in your annual budget and operational planning and prioritization, and in your regular communication out to your stakeholders. And then finally, just be practical about this. So we have revenue constraints. We can't accomplish everything, but we can put best practices in place so that we can operate our capital program more efficiently and effectively. And there are small steps that we can take over the course of several budget years to put ourselves in a healthier place financially overall. And with that, Amy, I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap us up.
All right, it looks like we do have time for Q&A. So I know, Keith, did you want to run through some of the questions that came through?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so we'll go through a few of these questions, and any ones that are left over, like I said, we'll follow up with all of you afterwards too. But a few of these I think will be good for the audience to kind of hear from us and everything. And the first one I wanted to put out there was, you know, a question on, you know, how would you recommend starting the conversation with City Council about setting aside dollars for a capital reserve fund? You know, I think this is a great question because we get this one quite a bit, and as we talked about on a few of these slides, you know, that is one of the challenges with setting up a reserve program, is getting that buy-in, you know, getting the governing bodies, whether it's City Council or a board, or whatever the governing body is, to actually, you know, sign off on that decision versus fund other programs or services. And so I'll put that question out there. Colleen or Steve, do you guys have anything to share on that from your experience?
You know, I think this is a really good question, and I think it's a really challenging one because, you know, like I just mentioned, it's very hard to get elected officials excited about something that's not new and ribbon cuttable. But I do find that it's most successful with local government if you can have an elected official champion this issue. Keith, in fact, you and I share a client that's a county government that's spent the last several years really focusing on deferred maintenance. They were able to get their whole board of supervisors on board with this idea of, okay, we're really going to take care of our assets and focus on these. A big part of that was their finance department started sharing their long-range financial forecast and doing some real scenario modeling over what would happen if they needed to wholly replace some of their facilities, because they were having a lot of issues with, okay, we've got some buildings where if we don't replace the roof here, the building is going to really start to degrade in these other ways. Having folks make kind of repeated presentations, biting off small chunks of what was important to them so that over time they became educated about the importance of the issue, and then they were able to set aside funds and invest accordingly. It's great to have that champion who can help you to communicate with the public and bring in additional stakeholders.
Perfect. I think that's really helpful. You know, the next question that we got here too that we wanted to put out there that might be beneficial for everyone is just, you know, how have your clients been utilizing ARPA funds that we're seeing out there now for capital expenditures? Colleen or Steve, either of you want to tackle that one?
So I can start with that one. I've seen many of my clients using ARPA specifically for capital because it's short term, right? We have about 3 years to spend ARPA dollars, and so it's kind of perfect for capital. One of the challenges with using it for capital, though, is that putting in new facilities is, I would say, more of a challenge than replacing or potentially using it for maintenance. So I'll give you an example of a city client that I have who they have a lot of undeveloped parkland. They also, like many other local governments, have operating revenue challenges. So while the community wants to build more parks, they don't have the day-to-day operations and maintenance funding to actually maintain additional parkland. So they can use the dollars to build more or replace park equipment that is existing and upgrade existing parks, but they can't feel like they can go ahead and develop new parks with these dollars. Thinking about really using ARPA strategically, but also not adding to your overall deferred maintenance backlog and creating a longer term problem by creating too much capital that you can't afford in the future.
Perfect. Well, I think, and Steve, did you have anything else to add on that?
Nothing here. That was perfect.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all that we've got here, and I'll pass it back to Amy to kind of close things out, and we'll follow up with the rest of you on any other questions.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Steve, Colleen, and Keith for a great presentation today. And thank you to our audience for your participation and for submitting those questions. If we didn't have time to answer yours, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. And also feel free to reach out to any of our presenters if you have additional questions. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. If you had participated as an individual and met all requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I will keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And here's a list of some resources and links that may be beneficial to your organization. All of these links can be found in your webcast console as well. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. And thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time.